Bum, bum, bum. Test. All right, friends on Zoom, can you see me okay? Can you hear me okay? On Zoom, you got it? Awesome. Can y'all hear me? Laura's giving me an ear. Ken, can you make me a little hotter in the room? Perfect, thank you so much. All right, test 1, 2, is that good? All right, great, we've got about, is this your 2-minute warning? 2-minute warning. Yeah, all right. Friends, I have that it's time. We're going to get started. It's so good to be here with you. I don't know that I've ever had a room set up exactly like this, where everyone was straight down the middle. Usually I'm used to seeing everyone across the back, as far away as possible. But I promise if you sit closer, I will not call on you or holler out at you unless we get to the question round and you ask me a question. But I'm glad to be back with you. Thank you very much. I know you were in good hands with Cindy Mood last week as I was on a clergy retreat with our other pastors of the church, and it was a joy. We did a lot of good work on that trip. So it's good to be back with you. We've got a lot of fun in store today. Before we jump in, though, I've got just a couple of little items. One, I want to remind you, next Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, which is, again, very early. I know some of y'all are like, Pastor Brad, that's Valentine's Day. And yes, it is. Occasionally, once every 20-some years, you get a lineup. We've had it twice in rather rapid succession. It's unusual, but due to the lunar calendar and solar calendar differences, we've got we've got Ash Wednesday falling on Valentine's Day. And so you'll want to be at that. So I don't give you a day off. I expect you to be at the Ash Wednesday service that evening or sometime during the day. We'll have ashes to go out here at the little Circle Drive from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. So you really have no excuse for not having the imposition of ashes. We'll literally have hundreds of people from the community drive through, and even people who aren't part of this church who will have ashes imposed on their forehead at that time. We'll have a lot electronica services throughout the day, morning, at noon, and in the evening over on our West Campus in the Journey, and then we'll have an evening service over here in the sanctuary. Check your bulletin or our website for the precise times, or ask me afterwards and I can look it up with you. We don't want you to miss it. I just don't have them all memorized, okay? The other thing I want to do is we have our sound tech. He also sings with our praise team over on our West Campus. Ken is here with us running our site, sound, and all things electronics. So want to show our appreciation for him. Doing good work for us. And then I'm also blessed for our time of prayer to have Dr. Stephen Martin with us, and Steve is going to, oh yeah. Now see, that wasn't as warm as this morning. Literally this morning, some women, woo, gave him a whole hoot out. So that was pretty good. But he's gonna sing for us. He's gonna sing verses 1, 3, and 5 of the summons. I think that, you know, as I reflected on what we're talking about today, what all these stories have in common is about following Jesus. And that song, The Summons, really speaks this well. So in a spirit of prayer, let's receive this beautiful song.
Will you come and follow me if I but call your name? Will you go where you don't know and never be the same? Will you let my love be shown? Will you let my name be known? Will you let my life be grown in you and you in me? Will you let the blinded see if I but call your name? Will you set the prisoner free and never be the same? Will you kiss the leper clean and do such as this unseen, and admit to what I mean in you and you in me? Lord, your summons echo true when you but call my name. Let me turn and follow you and never be the same. In your company I'll go where your love and footsteps show. Thus I'll move and live and grow in you and you in me. In your company I'll go where your love and footsteps show. Thus I'll move and live and grow in you and you in me.
Thank you. Steve, that's not bad for the first time singing that song.
Not shabby. I'm taking lessons.
That was so great. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful.
You're welcome.
What a way to set the tone for us. So, friends, now that I've rewarded you with something good, I thought we would now jump off into a pop quiz. Are you ready? I want to make sure you've been paying attention through these first few lessons. So we're going to put up the pop quiz for you, but I want to let you in on a little secret. The answers are already there in red. Okay, so just like in those books of old, the answers are there for you. The first question, though, is in the Gospel of Mark, who is Jesus, right? Jesus is the Christ or the Messiah. He is the anointed one. He is the rightful ruler of Israel and the people of God. Jesus is also the Son of God. You get to know this in verse 1, chapter 1. And some of you are like, if you don't know anything else, Pastor Brad, I will have learned that from Mark. You start every study with that this is always the first thing I go through. But the reason is because I want you to make sure you hold on to that, because we're going to have some things that we're going to talk about this week. And if you forget that, you may not kind of understand some of the things we're going to go to. Okay, so we're going to be following these stories, and that's important. I've got question 2 for you, though. You ready? All right, here we go. Question 2 on the pop quiz. Remember, I gave you a long list early days, I think it was that first lesson, of all the different groups of people that Jesus talks to or addresses in the Gospel of Mark. I wanted to pull out just a few for you in today, because there's just a few people that he's going to talk to. I want to make sure you had them at the front of your mind: the scribes, the Pharisees, the disciples, the people, or the crowd, because Jesus is going to be talking to different people. You might be tempted when Jesus is talking to think that what Jesus is saying is for everybody at all times, because I'm sure, like me, you grew up in whatever was in red letter. Well, that's just for everybody all the time. But here's the challenge. When you read those red letters and you look at who's being talked to, you need to remember that when Jesus is talking grace, he's usually talking to the crowd. When Jesus is talking kind of challenge or something to do, he's usually talking to the disciples. When Jesus is talking rebuke or something he's most upset about, he is almost always talking to the most religious. And here's the problem for us today. Guess who we are? We're the most religious. You showed up for a Bible study on a Wednesday night, right? And so we have to kind of look at that. Where the church in the modern world often gets it wrong, and a lot of false steeples around this town, is that you get people putting the rebuke to the people. And that's backwards. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus always rebuked those who should have known better, not those who lived on the street. Very important concept, okay? Next slide. So we're going to jump in with what I call the tradition problem. Now, for Methodists, this is going to be hard. How many of us have been Methodists for more than one generation? Anybody here a Methodist for more? Yeah, so about, like this morning, about 2/3 of the room. Tradition is a part of who we are. We do things in a similar way over and over and over again. That's why they called us Methodists. We had a method, we had a tradition. Jesus has an issue with tradition at times, because often in the time of Jesus's living, the tradition had taken place of actual compassion. The tradition had gotten in the way of allowing people to express or live out compassion, or even worse, tradition had allowed people to do things that exploited other people or circumvented the Word of God, like literally avoided doing one of the 10 Commandments because their tradition let them get out of it. And so Jesus is going to be kind of unhappy about that. So I want to share that with you. As we kind of go into this in the tradition problem, what I want to kind of do is set the page for you. So here in the beginning of chapter 7, what we have some Pharisees and some scribes that have come all the way down to Jerusalem. And now you know you have to be doing something kind of upsetting to be able to get the feds to come all the way out from the capital, okay? So they've come down to investigate what Jesus is doing, because he's gathering large crowds due to the healings that are happening, and people aren't following the locals. And so now there's trouble brewing. So here they are, the plot's on its way. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law, they bring a complaint against Jesus's disciples. Now what's interesting is that the complaint they bring is that they claim that Jesus's disciples are eating with hands that are defiled. Because, you know, that's what we do. I mean, none of us, I'm going to look up, I'm not talking about you. None of us have ever complained about something minor to one of our spouses when we were really mad about something else, right? No one ever does that. No one ever tries to say something to a neighbor about something insignificant when they're really mad about something major, right? None of our political parties ever do that, right? Like, that's just not how we work. That's how they were in the first century before they were all good like us, right? But occasionally people do this. And so what the scribes were doing was they were picking a fight about something small a technicality that they hoped they could trip up Jesus and his disciples on and turn the people against them for what they were doing. It's kind of interesting. So Mark will break down here on that second slide, on slide 5. I found this little, this is actually a first century pot. This is kind of one of those bronze little pots like is kind of described here. But what it says in the text is, Mark will explain to you that the Pharisees thoroughly washed their hands, observing the tradition of the elders, and do not eat anything from market that is not washed. They also wash cups, pots, and bronze kettles. Okay, now, I was going to ask y'all, I mentioned about the Methodist problem with tradition and stuff like that. Do you know what my title actually is in the United Methodist Church? Right? I mean, some people call me Dr. Morgan, some people call me Pastor Brad, some people say I'm a preacher, some people call me things that we can't repeat in polite company. I know my name's a 4-letter word, Brad, it is, But what I'm actually called by the United Methodist Church is an elder, right? An elder, right? So because we believe in tradition, well, elders tend to actually sometimes create problems. Also, I want to wonder, how many of you don't like dishwashing? Anybody prefer not to? How many of y'all have a dishwasher? Anybody? Right? I wish I could tell you that Jesus doesn't want you to wash dishes, right? But that's kind of not what's going on here, right? Because what we get here is they have this tradition of ceremonially cleaning up everything, washing their hands very thoroughly. And I mean, if you think about it, in what they're living in, have you ever been to a third world country where you had to go in and inspect the kitchen before you ate something? Like, it makes sense for digestional health. It's not a crazy thought to do that. So these people, these elders, they want to know why Jesus' disciples do not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands. It's an offensive thing to them, and they're there. It's funny at this point that Jesus then quotes the prophet Isaiah. He says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition." You see, Jesus seems deeply concerned with having something on the outside define how you treat people on the inside. You see, he seems deeply concerned with having something on the outside or a ritual you go through being something that would exclude people from the community or make them feel like they were less than or not part of. He is not going to allow the separation of human beings one from the other. There is nothing wrong with washing hands or dishes or cleaning your hands, but making that a barrier for entry into the community and excluding people is egregious to God. Anything that says that another human being is less than human due to tribal custom is unacceptable to God. But wait, he doesn't stop there. He points out their hypocrisy at a level that's really even more troubling. Jesus takes their small little thing and doesn't even hesitate to jump to the big thing, to say, you want to talk? Let's talk. Let me tell you what's really going on. And he introduces a topic called Corban. And I know all of y'all know exactly what Corban is, didn't you? Y'all know what it is? I had no idea. I had to look it up. I had to study about it a little bit. But Corban is an offering made to God. It can be a sacrifice by fire, a gift to the priesthood, or a gift to the poor. But where it gets to be a problem for these scribes all the way down from Jerusalem, how did they get airfare to make it from Jerusalem to Galilee? Why are they in that first-class jet on that big seat on the camel? How did they do that? Well, because they're using gifts to the priesthood and the gifts to the poor for things that God didn't intend them for. You see the problem? Nobody today does that, right? These offerings for God being misused. So Jesus explains how the Pharisees and scribes are breaking the commandment to honor their mother and father. Do you remember what's that command say? Honor your mother and father so that you may live long in the land. Anybody heard that commandment? Right? It's one of the big 10. It's one of the big 10. It's an important commandment. And there's more. So next slide. What they're doing is Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees and scribes for their practice of using things given to God as something for themselves. They are also, though, these scribes and Pharisees are also permitting people to basically give to God instead of our parents. Because apparently back then, and I know nobody does this now, but back then, occasionally, some parents upset their children. Did you know that? That never happens now, does it? To the point where the relationship gets broken or strained, and the child didn't want to support the parents. And so they would allow, instead, that to be given to God, saying that they would somehow take care of the parents, or God would do it, and then they would use those goods for themselves. You just thought what you read in the paper about bad preachers was something new and a sign of the times, didn't you? You didn't know it was biblical, and it goes all the way back. You forgot the stories about Eli and his boys, right? I mean, it goes way back. It's there. But the real thing is that they exploited the people by this loophole. And Jesus will not allow that. That's his issue. They're excluding people and exploiting people. And he'll have none of this. So now, Jesus has been talking to those scribes and Pharisees in front of his disciples, and now he calls the crowd. How do you think the boys from Jerusalem feel now when Jesus appeals to this massive crowd? A little bit threatened? Who has the power in this story now? And Jesus says to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand this. You can find this in verses 14 and 15. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. Okay, so what comes out of your heart is what defiles. And then Jesus is going to move inside into a house, and he's going to explain it to his disciples because they don't quite get it. Jesus makes clear that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer. And friends, no pun intended, but that's the cleaned up version of that. In Greek, it's a little worse, okay? But here's the good news. Remember, Mark's writing to people who live in Rome, many of whom are Gentile, and so he makes clear in this parentheses, thus Jesus declared all foods clean. Whew! I can have my fried shrimp. Very happy. How many of y'all anybody like a pork tenderloin? It's back on the menu, friends. We got it now. Here it is. But Jesus goes on to say this, and it's beautiful and important. It is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these things come from within, and they defile a person. You see, the problem with tradition is tradition might make someone think that what they do on the outside is all that matters. Now, of course, we know good tradition goes all the way through, and it impacts through practices a person's internal heart and gets them to think the right things and do the right things on the inside. But it's very important that Jesus isn't about just going through the motions or doing the appearance of the right thing even when you're doing it for the wrong reason. He's about having the internal mind and heart of a person transformed so that the right things comes up and out of who they are. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. You with me? All right. I will go and follow you. I can't sing it like Dr. Martin did, but are you ready to follow Jesus? Are y'all ready to go? I don't see that glimmer of hope in your eye. Are you up for the trip? Let's make a little note before we head out. Okay, on the next slide on 11. I normally do this at the very end, but I just wanted you to pay attention to a couple of things we're about to see in the next few stories. Note what Jesus says and does. Pay close attention. Jesus shatters systems that exclude people. Jesus does not tolerate exploitation of people, and Jesus now includes the excluded. Okay? Very important stuff. You're going to see this time and time again. So the first thing he does is we're headed out to a little coastal village, and we're going to get to relax. A little sleepy seaside village right across the border in another tribal land known as Tyre. And there in Tyre, we're going to kind of retire and prop our feet up. Can you feel your blood pressure going down? Can you hear the coastal waters? Does anybody like to walk in the forest? They've got the great cedars of Lebanon. Can you smell the trees? And then go by the seaside and chillax? And so he's there. And Jesus doesn't want anyone to know he's there. He's relaxing. He's in now hold on, Tyre. Hold on, is Tyre in Israel? It's it's kind of over in that other place. I mean, God knows right now horrible things are happening in that whole area of the world, but it's over in this other place with other tribes and groups of people. And a woman's little daughter has an unclean spirit, and she begs Jesus to heal her daughter. The woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. Well, of course, he's in Tyre. It's like the capital of Syrophoenicia. So, of course, she's of that origin. So this woman comes before pleading for daughter. Well, have we seen this before? Like, what does Jesus do when someone comes and pleads for their daughter? You remember Jairus? Right? He was the chief of the local synagogue, the president, we're told, of the local synagogue, and he comes to Jesus. And what was he doing at that time? I don't know. He was he was plotting to kill Jesus. He comes to Jesus and needs his daughter healed, and Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." No, right? What are we told Jesus does? He goes and heals him, right? Jesus goes over to the Gerasene shore, over with the pig herder. You know he's Gentile, right? Goes over to the pig herder, the one who's bound up by the graves and gets legion thrown out of him into the pigs and runs off into the water, and there he is on the shore, all there bound up, and Jesus heals him. He's a Gentile. So what do you expect to happen in this request? What is Jesus going to do? Jesus says to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Woo! Well, unless you're in Texas where dogs eat better than kids. That's actually true problem, but anyway, won't talk about that today. The woman responds, though, quickly, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." So why does Jesus say that? Is that because he didn't want to heal her? He had healed Gentiles before. What's up with that? Is he teaching? Maybe? Making a point? Showing his disciples? I don't know. It's an interesting interaction. But then Jesus said to her, for saying that, like coming back at him. For saying that, you may go. Also, saying that signifies her faith that Jesus is who he is, right? For the demon has left your daughter. So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. And friends, I want you to know, between now and the transfiguration in Mark, every miracle now is going to be with the Gentile. Mark is making a point. Okay, so sometimes people will say, well, in Mark, Jesus didn't really go to the Gentiles. That's a bunch of bunk. No, there's this one episode at the beginning, but there's a shift and a clarity that indeed the blessing and love and compassion of God is for all people. And it's made clear in this interaction between Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman in Tyre, where Jesus is just trying to catch a break. There in that coastal village, trying to get a moment of rest. But from that moment on, you're going to see all these other miracles. Do you see how, if you follow Jesus, when he calls your name, you might have to, what was the lyric? Did y'all hear the lyrics? You might have to lick the leper clean, right? You might be the prisoner set free and never feel the same. You see, tradition would say he shouldn't have talked to her. He's not, as a rabbi and holy man, even allowed to talk to her. He should have turned away when she spoke to him. And instead, he healed her daughter. And it drove the rest of what he's going to do. Ready to go to the Decapolis? Right? Let's go to the Decapolis, because that's a Jewish-sounding name. Decapolis. Well, it's a Roman-sounding name. Oh, what? It's Greek? It's Greek. Somebody knows their Greek really good. What does it mean? 10 cities. The 10 cities, right? So Jesus goes to the Decapolis. They brought him a deaf man who had a speech impediment and begged Jesus to lay hands on him. Jesus takes him away from the crowd because, as Jesus is able to heal, remember when we talked about who has doctors and who doesn't, right? I mean, all of y'all have a doctor or two or three. I don't think we found anybody with less than 3 doctors in this room, right? Right? Remember, in the ancient world, they had none. So they hear Jesus can heal. They're all on top of him, right? To do something. And so Jesus takes him away from the crowd. Jesus puts his finger in the man's. All right, so can you put your finger in your man? Can you touch your ears? No, try it out. Don't make me do this by myself. You got that? All right, now touch your neighbor's. No, just check. Nobody wants to. It's kind of gross, right? He does that. And Jesus spits, and touches the man's tongue, right? Isn't that kind of interesting? How it runs that. I mean, Mark is like running so fast through these stories, but he slows down about this. It's very interesting. And then he says, "Be open," is what it says in English, but it's aphatha. And immediately his ears were opened and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. This word here in Greek means more like unbound, or like when you pull out a knot, right? Untied. And so what we know about whoever wrote this down in the Gospel of Mark, what we have here from Mark is this beautiful understanding of what a person in the first century would think was going on physiologically inside of another human being. That something is stopping up their ears, and that's why they can't hear, and that somehow their tongue is tied. You've heard the expression in English, right? Tongue tied? Where does it come from? Right here, right? I mean, literally his tongue tied. So that's kind of what's going on here. And yet he's now able to then speak. It's beautiful. And then here, these 10 Greeks, we'll go to slide 15. This is actually a picture from a couple of years ago there. That is actually one of the cities of the Decapolis, Zipporah. They're looking at a part of it there. But the more Jesus told them not to tell anyone, the more zealously all of them proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." And I want to bring up a point I've raised before, a story I've said before. It gets Laura upset with me, but I'm going to say it again anyway. because I think it makes this point. One of the things we forget often in these healing miracle stories is that it wasn't just one person healed, it was a community. And so when Laura was over there recently on the mission, working on people's eyes, one of the people they healed was a pastor who had gone blind with cataracts and had not been able to see for a few years and was not able to do his normal things. And when he was healed, he was able to see his wife for the first time in several years, and there were lots of tears around that. He was able to read scripture again and to preach again and to be able to teach again. And it was really awesome. And when she was checking out of the hotel, unexpectedly, the lady checking her out said, "Were you part of that team?" And came around and hugged on her and her other roommate. She said, "You healed my pastor." Like, you healed the whole community, not just one person, right? When Jesus is doing these miracles, it's not just touching one life. It's touching everybody who knew that person from the time they were born, that he couldn't quite hear right and couldn't quite speak right, and now he had been unbound in his tongue and his ears had opened up. They also were set free with him. It's something we miss in the blessing of Jesus. It goes out and out and out and out and out, always. Beautiful. Next slide. This is the next part. So, as you can imagine, as this is happening, the reason I told that little story there is, well, people are gathering. There have been some healings happening, some stuff going on, and they're hearing about what Jesus has done. Even when he went up to Tyre, he couldn't hide, right? People followed him. And so now he's where? Does the text tell you? It really doesn't. He's somewhere between Tyre, the Decapolis, which is a pretty good region. It's like saying, well, it's somewhere in East Texas. Bonnie and Clyde are hiding out. You know, like it's a pretty vast region. Well, they might have actually been in Louisiana, but you know, somewhere over in there, they're there. He's in this big region. We don't exactly know where, but what we know is that 4,000 people have gathered there with him. And there they are, kind of in this wilderness space. If you go to the other feeding miracles, we'll know that that's at Tagbaha, but this one is kind of, we don't exactly know. And so there's another great crowd. I mean, that's how actually Mark introduces it, right? With nothing to eat, because the disciples are apparently the most unprepared people on the planet. And there they are. And Jesus calls his disciples and explains to them, though, to me, what's the most beautiful thing. Because think about it. This crowd there with him now has in it Jews and Gentiles from everywhere in the region. It even has people plotting to kill him who are following him, trying to plot his demise. And yet he feeds all of them. It's beautiful. And Jesus said, I have compassion for the crowd. You can find this in chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. Because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way home. And some of them have come from a great distance. And the disciples, in typical form, well, how can we feed these people? Like, do you remember what I said early on that I wanted you to remember? What was pop quiz question number 1? Who is Jesus? Right? Who is Jesus? He is the Messiah, the Son of God, right? Y'all remember? Why don't they remember? Like, why don't they get it? Like, do you see the problem? Why don't every time that I feel like my life is in a bad spot or something's happening to the people I love, why do I forget? Oh, I'm sorry, am I preaching now? Oh man, I'll get fired up and going. We'll do that in a minute. Slide 17. Jesus does what he always does. Isn't it beautiful? This is so good. First thing he does, hey, you see the bind? It's always interesting how it works. He's moved with compassion. This is going to happen. It happened on the Gerasene shore when he saw that man. You thought I mentioned that accidentally earlier just because he was a Gentile, but I actually was thinking about this too. You know, when he walks up to him, what it says, this word compassion, it literally says his stomach twisted upside down is what the word means in Greek. That's like compassion, like literally like your belly moves around. If I'm going to describe a time that happened to me, it was just a few months after the earthquake in Haiti when I went to Cafu, and there in that place where raw sewage was running down the middle of the street, I watched a 3-year-old child dip her hand in the water running down the street because she was dying of thirst and malnutrition. Right? I mean, my stomach turned. I was filled with compassion for that child. I literally, had I not been in a tap locked up, I would have grabbed her and brought her home. She would have been raised with my daughter Kate. Anyway. But that's how he describes how he felt toward the crowd. You see, what happens when we as believers see something, we don't call the church office. When we see something, well, we might, if we, to get support with other Christians, but usually the person who can see it and who has their stomach turned needs to get with other people to kind of journey with them. And then the first thing Jesus is going to ask, what do you got? What do you got? And the disciples say, we got 7 loaves. And you know what they do? Jesus says, good, bring them to me. He ordered the crowd to be seated. The next thing Jesus tends to do is organize. Sounds like a God we know, right? He ended up taking all this chaos and he orders it in the creation story. He puts things in their place. And so Jesus gets that 4,000 people to kind of get organized. And then with those 7 loaves that they had brought him, with what they had, he takes them, he blesses them, he offers them to God. And then he does the hardest part. He breaks them open, which that's always the part. Nobody likes to be broken open. Sometimes we have to be broken open to do what God has for us. And then he gives it out. But it's a 4-fold pattern. Do we ever do that? Do we ever take something and offer it up and then have it blessed and then break it and then share it? Like every Sunday at the Journey, once a month in the sanctuary? Like, it's the heart of communion. It's the heart of Jesus. It's what Jesus does. It also is the way that when we are moved with compassion, Jesus can take whatever we have to offer and use it to heal the wounds of the world. The way communion nurtures our soul, his love in this action can heal the world. If we'll even dare to offer who we are. And here's the thing. After he does this, some of the disciples, these knuckleheaded disciples, they go, oh, yeah. I'm sorry, there are 2 more fish. Sorry, Jesus, we forgot the fish. You got 4,000 people, and they forgot their 2 little fish. Jesus blesses those and gets those out too to everybody. And then there are 7 baskets full. Wait, I know. Well, Pastor Brad, those must have been small baskets, right? Giant loaves and small baskets is how you... No, it's a miracle. No, not a miracle. It's Jesus. It's who Jesus is and what Jesus does. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. If you follow him, you'll never be the same. And as they leave that spot, the Pharisees, who had been there, demand a sign. I think Mark is probably where Jesus head slaps the most. What? What kind of sign do you need? Right? He healed the girl. up in Tyre. He heals, unplugs, and looses the man's tongue on the way in the Decapolis. Now he's multiplied the elements and blessed the food. But no, the Pharisees want a sign from heaven to test Jesus because these weren't signs from heaven. Like, do you see the problem? Jesus sighs in his spirit. It's only going to happen a couple of times in this book. Pay attention. He sighs in his spirit. Why does this generation ask for a sign? I mean, it's just hard to even fathom the depth of the sigh. Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. And Jesus leaves them, gets into the boat to cross to the other side. And then I put our most dramatic slides. Guilt on the Sea of Galilee. Guilt on the lake. Are you ready? Because this is absolutely, to me, the funniest part of the book. You may remember, I did something kind of crazy. If you go back and you look at the cover slide on the very first one, I named the whole Bible study, Do You Not Yet Understand? Quoting the middle verses in Mark at the end of a scene that we're about to talk about. Everything we've done so far in Mark is getting ready for this scene. So right after this kind of encounter with the Pharisees, Jesus and the disciples get on a boat. They're together this time, so you don't have to worry about anybody. Nobody's walking on water or anything like that. They're all together. The disciples, friends, did I mention they're absent-minded and a little bit hapless, and they always seem to forget the bread? Guess what they did? They forgot the bread again, okay? And so they don't have any bread. I mean, don't worry about the baskets they just collected. Somehow they don't have them now. And so they're without the bread. And Jesus begins cautioning them about the disciples, about the yeast of the Pharisees and the leaven of the scribes. And it's kind of an interesting kind of play on words, because remember, if something were to rise, right, it would make the bread of the Passover unholy, right? It's supposed to be unleavened bread, right? So you don't want it to leaven. But there's kind of a lot going on here. Either way about it, you just know that Jesus is saying these people are bad and they're going to infect what you're doing, right? Their way of thinking about their peculiar legalism and making tradition more important than compassion is going to infect your movement if you are not careful. But the disciples think that Jesus is saying this because they forgot the bread and they feel guilty. And I mean, friends, we never do that. We never allow our guilt to interrupt what Jesus might have for us. None of us are ever so busy thinking through our laundry list of the things we were supposed to do that week on Sunday morning that when we're in church, we realize some of the stuff that maybe we forgot for the gathering that afternoon. Nobody's ever done that, have they? No one's ever thought through things other than worshiping God in the moment or been focused on Jesus. You've never thought through your own issues during a Sunday service, have you? You see, they were doing the same thing. They thought Jesus was talking about them, but he was actually talking about something bigger at that time. And here's where Jesus kind of lets them have it. Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you fail to see? Do you fail to hear? Do you not remember? And then Jesus reminds him of the feeding miracles. But my goodness, couldn't he have reminded him of the last time they were on the boat? Like, well, take your pick. Like all the different things that they've seen and experienced. I mean, how many times do we say, oh, Jesus, if I had just been with Jesus, I could really believe. Well, friends, they didn't do so well. Those closest to him. They were kind of lost. But he says in Mark here, do you not yet understand? Now let me pose that a different way. What if Mark has made this the center of the Gospel of Mark because he's writing to a group of people who are having a hard time figuring out how to live together? And what as they're trying to be community, they are running into the challenges of life that we see every day, and they're having to be reminded. You see, we can't fail to perceive or understand. We can't allow our hearts to be hardened. We can't fail to see or to hear or to remember, because if we forget, we'll become no better than the Pharisees. If our hearts are hardened and we lose our way and our compassion fails, we're just going through vain practices of something I can't even recognize that has really lost its way. And so I don't think it's any accident that the next healing is the blind man at Bethsaida. Not because I don't think this healing happened. I think Mark put it here because it's also an amazing metaphor for what needs to happen to the followers of Jesus. Arriving at Bethsaida, people bring a blind man to Jesus. Jesus again, what is it with the spit? It's kind of gross. Maybe the Pharisees were, but I would wash my hands, but anyway. So saliva on the man's eyes and asked if he can see. The man looked up and said, I can see people, but they look like trees walking. What an interesting description, right? Almost like when if I don't have my glasses, hey, look at those trees. Oh, there y'all are. Hey, cool. Right? I mean, Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. You see, it's kind of like where we are to be at this point of the book. We've heard the stories, we've heard the admonishments, we've traveled with the disciples, we've seen the miracles, we've experienced Jesus' inclusion of all the tribes of the earth, and we've been asked, who are we? What do we believe? What do we see? What do we hear? What do we remember? And we're still kind of trying to look. We're still trying to understand. But we're starting to see, and if we look intently, we might see who Jesus is. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, the one we follow. All right, I'm going to run out of time here, but I've got one more slide, I think. And I think that's where I ended it for the other one. And we'll kind of end it there. I might try to get... All right, we're getting close. But Caesarea Philippi, I just want to show it to you real quick. Next slide. These are kind of parts of the wall there. In the old days, there were lots of temples here. If there was a god, there was a temple there. It's at a spring that pours out of a cave, and is at the headwaters of the Jordan River, and it runs all the way down and into the Dead Sea down there. And so that's kind of where it is. And it says that on the way to Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asked his disciples, who do you say that I am? The disciples answered, John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. And Jesus asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answers him, you are the Messiah. And Jesus orders him not to tell anyone about them. And then right there in that place at Caesarea Philippi, Caesarea Philippi, that place up there on the hill, Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Jesus said all this quite openly. Now, imagine the pain in the brain for Peter. Jesus just said, don't tell anybody. And Peter's idea of a Messiah is very different, right? And so all that's going on. So of course, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Then Jesus turns and looks at his disciples. Fascinating. He didn't actually address this to Peter. He looks at his disciples to say what he's going to say to Peter. He rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And then he talks to the whole crowd, and we'll end on this speech here in these 2 slides. Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And he said to them, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." And so I would just ask a couple of questions about that, and we'll do that with slide 30, so we'll jump to the end there. Yeah, thanks, Ken. Oh, one back. There we go. So we end with kind of who is Jesus for us. And so as we kind of reflect on these slides, and don't worry, those slides in between are about the transfiguration, and that's what I'm preaching on Sunday. So just show up Sunday or watch the video, okay? You can still get those slides. Who does your world exclude, right? And how do you pay attention to them? What tradition keeps you from doing what you should? The way you know it's a tradition that keeps you from doing what you should is you don't even think it is. I can guarantee it. And does guilt ever distract you from Jesus? Do you let your own guilt prevent you from focusing on what Jesus is trying to say about God and the world? And then the other question I would just ask on that from that last kind of long passage about losing your life and gaining your life and all that kind of stuff is, yeah, I think Jesus would also say the opposite is true. If you haven't given your life away, have you really followed Jesus? So, just a thought. All right, I'll stop there and I'll take questions and we'll go from there. I know some choir members got to go. Thank y'all for giving me that extra time. Tell Stephen it was because his song went 2 minutes too long. It was great. Tell him how awesome it was because that was sweet. I can't do that every week, friends, but I enjoyed doing that. So, yeah, any questions? Yeah, Gary. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So, unlike today, when things are written in a hurry or on a word processor or these kind of things, what was happening back then, I mean, a work like Mark would be written in a lifetime. And it would be written and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. So it was not written likely in one setting. It was being, what we believe about the Gospel of Mark is that it was being told and retold and told and retold. There would have been people at the time that could tell you the word count of it and tell you that they had minds that could do that. And kind of like think of, have you ever been to like the Masons when they do like a funeral or something and they can recite these extremely long passages and that kind of stuff? It's very much kind of like that way of thinking in these trainings in the synagogues and in the teachings of those times. And so we think that what was happening is that these stories were being told along caravan routes. So somebody would walk along somebody and say, like, have you heard the story of Jesus? And then like you get the whole Gospel of Mark on the half day walking wherever you were walking. And so we think that it emerged in that tradition. And then that I think I mentioned Father Brown, who wrote down the book, The Apostles Left Behind, talking about the Bible. He really makes a really cool point of this about kind of talking about, I don't agree with all his conclusions, but his general premise that the Bible gets written down in kind of these communities at the point at which a generation is realizing they need to pass this on to the next generation. And so I think for Mark, it's going to form over a long period of time. And yes, very much they know where the middle of it is. And Mark most perfectly demonstrates. I said it for Matthew, and Matthew has a little bit of it, but Mark has chiastic structure straight through. It's a big X, and how it's designed. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so why do I'm going to just repeat it for those on Zoom. Why do the disciples seem to have such a hard time understanding that Jesus is the Messiah? Yeah, each one of the Gospels covers that just slightly differently. Now, for Mark, remember, the disciples are going to abandon Jesus in the end. And so they're not going to kind of reconstitute until till later. Mark kind of leaves all of that to our kind of supposition and imagination. And especially in the original version of Mark, that doesn't have the extended ending that got added a few centuries later to most Bibles. The original version of Mark ends with just everybody being the women being terrified that the tomb was empty. We don't even hear that the women ran back to Peter like the angel told them. They were just terrified, right? So it kind of stops in this awkward place. But I think that's its artistry. Now, as far as why they don't get it, there seems to be a real challenge for them to understand the divinity of Jesus because they're continually living with his humanity. So it's something that they see along the way. And in this story that we just got to the first of today, where Peter figures it out first, which is kind of unusual for some of the other Gospels. He's kind of the hard-headed one in other Gospels, but in Mark, he kind of gets it first. And so he gets it in Caesarea Philippi, you are the Messiah. Now, other stories will have different things they add to that in the other accounts, but in Mark's, it's pretty straight. He got it, but he still tries to rebuke Jesus because Jesus was saying too much he didn't want to hear about Jesus having to die and suffer, right? That seems to be Mark's problem. But you're going to have it in the Transfiguration very clearly. And so after the Transfiguration, the disciples in Mark will tend to know, but because of the different opinions about what messiahship should mean, there's a real difference in how obedient they are or are not to Jesus. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. And so in Mark, what happens is, in Mark, it's really clear, before the Transfiguration, it's not time. After the Transfiguration, Jesus heads to Jerusalem, and it's time. So before that, he has that one demon who tells, and of course you got the guy in the Decapolis who tells everybody, but Jesus tries to keep it under wraps in Mark. But after the Transfiguration, he's heading to Jerusalem. He knows what he's doing. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry, does the church include or exclude support or not support? Well, the United Methodist Church has a pretty complex statement on it that basically says Christians and faithful people can have wide varying thoughts about capital punishment. I, for one, tend to be a person who would not support capital punishment in general. I might support it in specific. I got asked one time to pray with a jury that was recommending the death penalty. and to pray with them about their civic duty. The assistant DA was a member of my church, and I feel like whether I agree with the laws of the state of Texas or not on the death penalty, I also have a civic duty that's an important religious function that I would have to serve out those laws, whether I agreed or not. And I should work to change them if I disagree with them for religious reasons. But as far as like, do we believe that anyone should be killed for any reason? Not if there's any hope of redeeming them. Do we believe that some people need to be incarcerated, locked away, detained, or prevented from being in the general population due to harm that they may cause themselves or others? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things most people don't know about the death penalty is it costs more than keeping the person alive and in jail for life because of the appeals. So it's actually cheaper to house them than it is to take their life. But in general, I am not would not be it's a bit tricky in that the people I've known who have told me about their experience with someone that they loved being killed and then someone pursuing the death penalty is they were not satisfied after the person was killed, that there was still just the same hole. It didn't make anything better. So if there is actually no justice from it, the state, I understand the state has to reserve the right to use power and force in the state. We have to have order. So I'm not a person who doesn't believe that the state needs to, I think we need an army. I think we need a navy. I think we need police officers. I think we need civil order. I'm a big fan of that. If you want to know kind of what, I'm probably somewhere between Locke and Hobbes on this, but like if you want my little Edmund Burke sprinkled in for good measure. But as far as the death penalty, the problem I always have with it is you can't guarantee that no one will be unjustly killed by the state. And because you can't guarantee that, there's always the possibility, no matter how small, that that could happen. And so, again, unless you're going to find a way to convince me that there's a better good that would come from that or a justice served by it, but I'm not of a settled mind on that. I certainly think my religious inclination would say, I don't think you want to, like, I don't think I'm a good person to set policy. I think I'm a good person to work with whatever system we have to love within it. Christians have loved people within systems that had the death penalty and within systems that didn't. And I think we have to work within whatever system we find ourselves. And we have to work to change whatever system to make it more closely aligned with God. So I think whatever system would do the most benefit to the most people will be the right system that we need to like look toward. But I'm not persuaded that that alone will do what needs to be done, because if we don't match, I mean, like, let's get real. I mean, the real problem we have is that so few people are having two-parent households, and in the single-parent households, the support they need to be able to make a living wage and to have an opportunity to raise children in a healthy way. And so because of that, we have a society in free fall because we're putting everything on the police and on incarceration instead of on actually helping raise people to be responsible citizens. We're putting things on teachers that are impossible for teachers to take on. So we have a lot of civil services that are needed to come alongside our schools. And so I think we should be investing in those. So I mean, I guess for me, the death penalty, not death penalty, isn't going to solve this. I mean, to me, the bigger issue, which is how do we get there? And then we also have a mental health crisis of epidemic proportion. I mean, my wife works in the ER. The ERs in our state are the holding place for mental health. When you can't get a bed at the ER and you have to wait 8 hours, that's because there are 8 to 12 people in every ER in the state of Texas that are taking up beds because there's no place to put them because we cut and slashed funding for mental health in this state. We have less mental health monies going today as a part of our GDP than we did in the 60s. I don't think we got more conservative over time. I think we were pretty conservative back then too. I think we We should be funding mental health, right? It's just it's not a good look if we want to be first world. So I think there are just some things we got to kind of work on as a society. So I hear the death penalty debate. I'm not a zealot on either side on that one. I'm always going to probably err on the side of life. It's like people often ask me, because the other one, right, is just war theory. Like, is there ever a time a nation should be able to go to war, and can Christians sanction war? I went to a whole convention on this thing. And the problem where I come down with that is that the problem is for Christian followers of Jesus sanctioning war at any level, is that if we open a door at all to say there is anything like a just war, people who have bad will and intention will use that all day long to do things that are really bad to exploit people. So I think, for me, I see the death penalty kind of the same way. Is if I open the door at all, then people will try to use it to justify things that are pretty egregious to God. But can I ever imagine a situation where somebody should be put to death? Yeah, can. What? About birth control? About. Do you mean pro-life, pro-choice? If you use the language of birth control, I have a different view. I'm very much a proponent of birth control. In our own family practice, we use birth control. Obviously, I don't have more kids than I do, right? I think, though, if you're asking me on is the recording off at this point, Ken? No, I can leave it on. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're gonna put the 9:30 on, right? Make sure the 9:30 goes on the web. All right. But on the birth control thing, no. So on abortion, I've never seen my role as a pastor to be challenging for women who've gone through the horror of having to choose to have an abortion. I've yet to see a way or society in which limiting a doctor and a woman's ability to make decisions for her health is a good thing. And at the same time, I can't imagine a way where it's ever somebody's will or desire to kill a child, right? So like those are things that I think what happens is in the arguments about it, people caricature one side or the other, or there's only one way to think about it. I don't think there's an easy way forward on that topic. And I don't think there's a way, without listening to a whole lot of people that have gone through a whole lot of hurt, guilt, and shame on it, that any way forward can kind of be built. But I think that right now, maybe the pendulum swung a little far in Texas to limit access to healthcare for women. I think there's a more reasonable place that it should land. But at the same time, I feel like, I'm not for the death penalty. I'm probably going to listen and take the advice of my daughter a lot when it comes to how she feels about abortion, because likely I'm not going to ever have a need for one myself, right? And so I'm going to listen to her thoughts and women's thoughts about that, and kind of try to understand. But I don't think the topic is nearly as black or white as many people try to make it. I think that oftentimes the mistakes we find ourselves in is people with any form of intellectual generosity and kindness get pushed out, and only the loudest voices and angriest are being heard on these topics. But I think that the problem is we don't live in a healed and whole world. So sometimes we're always trying to make the best choice out of bad situations. And that's why I'm kind of reluctant theologically to limit the choices that we can make. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Oh, how do you make a law? That's a great question. I think, how to say, now here I'm almost libertarian. I mean, like, I think less laws would be better. I mean, I'm not a fan of a whole lot of, I mean, so, you know, a few Christmases ago, they made these little two-wheel kind of, they're like, they have the wheels on the end and they have the batteries that make them kind of go, and everybody who ever stands on one falls and busts their whatever and stuff like that. I guess I never felt like I needed a tag on that to tell me I might fall if I got on it. You know, I was never stupid enough to get on it in the first place. And so, like, I never thought the government should be involved in every aspect of my life. I don't need them telling me everything I can and can't do. I find the times we're in where everything is so deeply regulated kind of troubling. Now, I'm all for protecting kids. I'm all for safety. I'm all for you know, not being, like I say, not making products that harm kids. But I'm deeply concerned about, I guess, to me, what I would call the movement of regulation to the consumer instead of the company. So there were things like in the inspection of food or healthcare. I mean, the idea that medicines can advertise, like, that's a new phenomenon in America. That's only like 15, 20 years old. Oh yeah, you used to not be able to advertise medicines for a long time. The doctor prescribed a medicine. You couldn't advertise it, right? I mean, Big Pharma fought for that, right? The idea, I mean, anyway, there's a lot of things that people are allowed to do to, like, I don't know, that aren't in the best interest of the individual. Those things, and they're doing that. I mean, those things concern me a little bit. I'm all for more protection. So if you try to put me on a political spectrum, I think you're going to have a hard time pegging me down, because I'm all for solutions. And then the other thing too I try to do is, on any issue, I actually like to go to like when I did some stuff in Bowie County, like, I actually went and talked to guards in jail about incarceration. I didn't try to say it from some sort of outside perspective. I tried to actually talk to people who were doing that. I talked to inmates who had been incarcerated about the experience. I didn't talk about it in some sort of, like, extra way, like a political way, but in a personal way. And also too, those people on the front line, they've got good thoughts about how to make things better, and nobody's listening to them. Like, they could actually make things like 5 times better than what it is, but nobody cares about what the frontline folks say. Yeah. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Mm. Yeah. Uh-huh. Wow. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Private. Yep. That's right. Yeah. They're just keeping it cheap. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And then they're selling the product that the inmates make. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what I'd be remiss if I did not recommend for you, if you go to umc.org, if you look up our social principles, the United Methodist Church has some great statements on all these topics, called our social principles. And when our general conference comes together, we produce every 4 years a United Methodist Book of Discipline. that has kind of our church law in it. But a subset of that is a little thing called our social principles, and they're kind of they're kind of a statement of what we think. It's actually a very balanced, well thought out. It's not a partisan hack sheet. It's actually pretty well evenly reckoned and thought through kind of approach on lots of topics, everything from human sexuality to deforestation to global warming to death penalty to, I mean, all these things. I think everything I said was basically the social principles almost always say it's really complex. I mean, like each one kind of takes it, but it's got some great verbiage if you're interested in what the church thinks about them. So I don't think I said anything that didn't comply with our our social principles. Uh-huh. Yeah.
And the bottom line is, you said it earlier,
yeah, I mean,
the only thing that makes sense.
Right. I mean, I think it's hard to create a tradition or law that covers every situation. I mean, there's a reason. Uh-huh. Oh yeah, that's absolutely right.
We're human. We're not supposed to do that.
That's absolutely right. All right. CA and Paul, y'all been sticking with us. Have we been some good entertainment? Y'all got anything to say? Oh no, give me thumbs down. Oh, Paul, thank you, CA. Yeah, that's why you're my favorite, CA. All right, can't hear? All right. Well, y'all have a good night.